This is lecture 15, and it's concerning Led Zeppelin and Black Sabbath. And one way of thinking of Led Zeppelin and Black Sabbath is to think of them both as prototypical bands for their genre. This idea of a band being a prototype simply means that instead of thinking of a genre as having a set of set characteristics or even a loose set of characteristics, that there is one band that exemplifies the genre. And so you know if you're in that genre, if you're related in some strong way to that band. Many people feel that Led Zeppelin is the band most prototypical of hard rock, while Black Sabbath is most prototypical of heavy metal. And they both, as we'll see in this lecture, are concerned with the relationship between man and machine. So let's get started. So let's talk a little bit more about the music industry in the 1970s. This is a period of consolidation for the industry. And so that means that corporations focus more of their resources on fewer bands, bands that they believe will create maximum revenue through album sales. So a lot of album sales. This is also a period of corporatization, meaning that major record labels are, for the most part, no longer independent businesses, they're large corporations. The six main corporations are Columbia, and they're together now with CBS, Warner, RCA Victor, Capitol, which is together with EMI, MCA, United Artists, which is together with MGM. So you see these larger conglomerates. And those six corporations are responsible for 80% of the sales by the end of the 1970s. So over the course of the 70s, things are more and more focused on the big corporations. Profits, another thing I think it's on the next slide, but another thing that's important is that for the most part in the 70s, we're not talking about very many independent labels until the end with the rise of punk. Profits soar in the 70s, $2 billion in 73 and $4 billion by 78, in part because of the rise of cassette tapes, and we'll talk more about that later. The money comes largely from platinum albums, from these albums that sell mass numbers. And here's the thing I was just mentioning, in the early 70s, smaller independent labels, they just can't compete. We'll see that they come back with punk. There are shifts here in music consumption. Radio formats are diversifying in one sense through more categories. So we have middle of the road, or MOR. We have easy listening, adult contemporary, country pop, soft soul, soft rock, hard rock, heavy metal, etc. AM radio is becoming increasingly restrictive, and therefore it's harder for bands to get on there. So FM radio becomes really the mainstay over the course of the 70s. And we also have, from the late 60s, the rock press developing, a lot of it in imitation of Rolling Stone magazine, which is becoming increasingly influential. And of course, we have stadium rock concerts. So as we'll see, Led Zeppelin breaks the Beatles record for attendance at a rock concert. The 1970s are also a period of nostalgia, and this is perhaps surprising this early in the life cycle of rock and roll. After all, rock and roll starts roughly in 1954, and already, just 20 years later, there's this nostalgia for the beginning of it. In part, this is part of the widespread adoption of countercultural style as style. But there's also a renewed interest in the 1950s fashion, especially later in the decade. There's also the rise of oldies radio at this time. Elvis is still performing. Chuck Berry is returning to the stage. Other people, Little Richard, tours throughout the 70s. But now, at least partly, they're all viewed as throwbacks to an earlier era. And then several other forms of entertainment also tap into nostalgia. So, for instance, we have the film from 1973, American Graffiti, which, as you can see on the poster there, where were you in '62? So thinking back 11 years to an older time, just a decade removed, but still. And then, of course, from 1974 to '84, there's the TV show Happy Days, set in the '50s and the beginnings of rock and roll. Very popular TV show, sitcom. Now let's turn to the band Led Zeppelin. And of course, Led Zeppelin consists of four people. You've got John Paul Jones on bass and keyboards, Robert Plant on vocals, John Bonham on drums, and Jimmy Page on guitar. They're a band, as a band, they formed in '68, and they last until John Bonham's death in 1980. They are the prototypical hard rock band, typifying the sound of that extended genre. And as we'll see, hard rock diversifies, but they really typify the sound of where it starts. They come out of the British hard blues scene alongside other groups like Cream and Jeff Beck, and they're derived from the remnants of the Yardbirds. Uh, Jimmy Page joins the Yardbirds, and then it seems to fall apart under him. And for whatever reason, he's left with the name. He's left with the copyright on the name. And so at first, he's just trying to find a band to put together so he can tour and finish up the touring dates that the Yardbirds had already set. They signed with Atlantic with a $143,000 advance, which would be over $1 million in today's money. This is the largest contract of its time. By 1973, they were 10% of all Atlantic sales, so a huge amount of the pie chart, if you will, for Atlantic Records. Each of their 9 studio albums were in the top 10. 6 of these were #1 hits. They had 8 consecutive #1 records in the UK. They basically owned the 1970s in the same way that the Beatles owned the 1960s. In 1973, in the U.S., they broke the Beatles' touring record, and then in 1974, they start their own label, Swan Song, just as the Beatles had started Apple Records, and they signed bands like Bad Company and various other bands. Their first album, Led Zeppelin, released in January '69, did quite well for them, although it came under some critical fire. And it starts right away by showing you sort of some of the characteristics of their sound. Let's hear just a little bit of the opening of How Many More Times, one of their blues-based songs. So that riff kicks in. Notice it stays on that riff throughout, right? It doesn't outline the 12-bar blues in quite the way we might expect it to. But compare that, notice the psychedelic elements, notice obviously the heavy rock elements. Compare that to their version of a Joan Baez song, Babe, I'm Gonna Leave You, where everything's acoustic. And so right from the beginning, you can see the sort of two sides of Led Zeppelin. You have the acoustic side, the folksier side, kind of a mystical folk, if you will. And we'll talk a bit more about that in a moment. And then on the other hand, you have the heavier blues-based sound. Some characteristics of the band. They have these huge studio productions, especially after this first album, as we'll see. But even on the first album, you have songs like Dazed and Confused, which are these big numbers. The lyrics tend to have spiritual and mystical elements, along with the blatant sexual imagery, as we'll talk about a little more in a second. They drew from many classic blues recordings. Some would say they stole from these recordings, and that controversy continues, as well as drawing on folk material. And we're going to come back to this issue of theft or putative theft. Their recordings range, as we just saw, from heavy electric songs to more pastoral, countryish or folkish acoustic ballads. And some of the more epic songs combine elements of both, and we'll see that in a moment with Stairway to Heaven. Their live shows even featured an acoustic set in the middle of the show, so they really emphasized this variety. They thought of their albums as the central aspect of their output, and they really resisted having songs re-edited and shortened to become radio singles, which was typical practice in the 70s. You have the long version that goes on the album, and then you have a shorter version for the radio, and they really resisted that early on. When they were accused of gaining success through hype, they released their fourth album without a title. It's sometimes called Zoso because of the symbols on it, or sometimes it's called Led Zeppelin 4 because it's simply the fourth album, but it doesn't really have a title. And without the name of the band on the cover. Houses of the Holy from 1973 obviously does have a title, but it also has no more information on the front cover. And then Physical Graffiti, a double album, was widely viewed as their bid for respectability. And I think it was In Through the Outdoor that was originally packaged in just a plain paper bag. Continuing with some characteristics, many of their songs are epic works with numerous overdubs, surprising shifts in texture and feel, and grand ambitions. Page retained a strong grounding in the blues, but he also explores really intriguing harmonies, he and John Paul Jones, including extended chords and suspended chords. One of the great examples of that, in my mind, is No Quarter, which I'm hoping to put up a video talking a little bit about No Quarter tomorrow. At times, the counterpoint in these songs, and you'll see this, for instance, in the song that you're writing about, 10 Years Gone, the counterpoint created among the various guitar parts is rather surprising. Sometimes you wind up with parallel fourths, which is not typical in parallel writing in popular music or really hardly anything else. And this sets the path for some of the progressive bands that follow from Led Zeppelin, some of which we've already talked about. The band also explores a wide range of sonic effects or sound effects like phasers, flange, reverb effects, echo, and so on, really drawing on the influence of psychedelic bands, as we heard a little bit already. And a great example of their epic approach is 10 Years Gone, of course. Now, one of the things that they raise is this issue of the live versus the studio recording. When you get into the 70s, studio recordings are becoming so complex and so intricate that they're really impossible to create live without hiring a whole orchestra. And unlike the Beatles, Led Zeppelin never retreats into the studio to simply be a studio band. So what they do is they prepare different versions or different approaches to their songs for live performance. Some fans loved it. But it was also very typical to complain that they just didn't sound like they do on the recordings. My first guitar teacher used to say that all the time, and it always bothered me. This was the one thing that we thought about. Now, this demonstrates what's happening in the 70s, which is that listeners are placing more and more emphasis on the recording as the thing, rather than the live performance of the song as the thing. We can call this a shift in ontology. Ontology is just a fancy way of saying the manner of being of a thing, right? So if I'm saying that the ontology of a song is its recording and its life as a recording, then that's very different from saying that the ontology of a song, the manner of being of a song, is when we play it live. So whereas throughout most of recording history, at least up to the mid-60s, the recording was secondary to live performance, and in fact was treated somewhat as promotional material just to get people to come out to the live performance, now the recording is the primary site of musical experience. You're sitting in your bedroom with the headphones on, and you're listening to and really absorbing all the elements of the recording. Some of that comes out of course, the Beach Boys and the Beatles, right? It was their innovations that got us here to a certain extent. The lyrics. Plenty of songs are about sex. Some of these are very blatant, like squeeze my lemon till the juice runs down my leg. If you can't figure out what that means, ask someone else. Several of the lyrics are lifted from blues standards, and that's what happens, for instance, with How Many More Times. Most of those lyrics come from other blues standards. And this is not something new. This is something that happens in traditional blues anyway. And we're going to come back to that issue in just a second. Other songs involve pastoral themes, the idealization of the country, simple living. Some songs have references to fairies and mysticism, even some Tolkien references. Some of the best lyrics are a bit more elusive and difficult to pin down, and I think 10 Years Gone is a good example of that. It's clearly about some kind of loss, but it gets rather caught up in some of its poetic allusions. And you'll discuss that, of course, in your paper. So there's an element here, at least they're trying to suggest, that there's an element of a return to an oral culture, right? In the blues tradition, and the blues tradition was an oral tradition, phrases of lyrics and even some musical patterns and phrases and accompaniments were widely adopted without a sense of direct ownership. It wasn't the idea that when you sang a certain lyric, you weren't necessarily covering another artist. You were borrowing something that was out there in the air, in the culture. So it's very common in the early tradition to take a variety of different lines that are circulating and combine them to create a new song. So the blues tradition is an oral tradition. It doesn't have a solidified notion of authorship as ownership, right? Copyright didn't apply, obviously, and people looked at it as more of a kind of folk culture, at least at first. Now, Zeppelin often claims that they were doing the same thing, but many critics feel that this is inherently unfair. That it's inherently unfair. Now, the classic example of oral tradition is, of course, Homer from ancient Greek poetry. Homer, who is the author, quote unquote, of the Odyssey and of the Iliad, he was blind. He didn't write any of this down. And in fact, the Odyssey and the Iliad weren't written down until a long time after Homer was alive. Homer was a bard. What he would do is he would memorize his poetry and sing it to accompaniment, and he would travel around and perform this. And people who were bards following Homer's example, they would memorize this, and then they would sing it. Now, you know what happens just from a basic game of telephone when you have something that you say to someone else and then they try to say it back and then that goes to someone else and so on. Things change. So there's probably a good bit of the Odyssey and the Iliad that's not the same as it was before, right? And that's part of an oral tradition. It's something that continues on and on. That might be a bit of a problem when we're talking about what we're talking about now, which is the 1970s and recordings as the tradition or as the ontological basis for music. The question then becomes, what kind of tradition are we talking about? In one sense, records create a new kind of oral tradition because they're not dependent on written culture. They're not dependent on scores and texts uh, in the way that, say, most of classical music is, or certainly is now. Most of us learn through imitation of our favorite popular musicians. I mean, sometimes we buy sheet music, but for the most part, it's from listening and trying to sound in the same way that they sound. But the focus here is not from person to person, as is typical of oral culture. Someone who was following Homer might have learned from Homer, or a pupil of Homer's, or a pupil of a pupil, and so on. What we're dealing with here, though, in this tradition, is moving from an object, the recording, to a person, who then perhaps creates another object, meaning another recording. This makes the documentation more secure. A record doesn't change the way that Homer's poetry might change. And this is perhaps best described as what Robert Cantwell, a scholar who works mostly on bluegrass, calls an aural culture instead of an oral culture. So an aural culture obviously relating to the ear. Now, copyright and the need to live off of the profits of one's creative work very much apply to this aural culture and therefore have an impact on what we understand is happening when we're talking about borrowing. So one argument that's often made is what we might call the profitability argument. Because Led Zeppelin is positioned to make more money off of their music than most people in the world at that time were, there's an inherent lack of fairness when they are borrowing from some less famous band, and that band goes uncredited and therefore uncompensated. So even if you're saying, well, this line of the blues has been used in a bunch of different recordings, and Howling Wolf, for instance, isn't the first to have come up with it. uh, there's this sense when it comes to Led Zeppelin making millions of dollars that maybe there's something inherently unfair about that. This, by the way, is still going on today with a lawsuit that's still somewhat alive. In 2014, a band, not a blues band, called Spirit, or rather the estate of that band, sued because they felt that the opening of Stairway to Heaven was too similar to the opening of one of their songs called Taurus. Let's hear a little bit of it. This is Stairway to Heaven, the very opening. Now here's the beginning of Taurus. It'll take a moment to get to the. Now clearly both have that descending part and then some counterpoint, some arpeggiation against that descending part. Uh, on Monday, March 9th of this year, so just days ago, Led Zeppelin just won an appeal on the Ninth Circuit Court, from the Ninth Circuit Court, that upheld an earlier ruling that Led Zeppelin did not infringe on copyright. This would be something we could maybe discuss on Tuesday. This critic, Robert Christgau, said in the review that at some deep level, Led Zeppelin's music is about the relationship between humanity and technology. Philosophically, the band prefers humanity pure and simple, but in practice, it must realize its humanity technologically. That seems truer than most good time pastoral fantasies. I think you can see this very clearly, for instance, in the song Stairway to Heaven, which we heard a little bit of in the discussion about about copyright. But listen to the whole thing. You'll hear that it's about this woman, and she goes and the stores are all closed, and then later she's in the forest, and you know near the brook and things like that. Eventually, the piper is calling to you, right, to lead you into this more natural state. And so there's this dichotomy set up between the technological and the um, the more natural. And of course, the song itself becomes increasingly technological, as you'll hear when you listen to it, in the sense that it moves from relatively acoustic instruments, classical guitar and flute and so on, and then you move toward more rock instruments, distorted guitar and more drums and a bigger sound. And listen to the whole song. It's a sectional song. The first part is alternating between this verse and then I guess you could call it a refrain or a contrasting section where the part where he's saying um, and it makes me wonder. And then you build up with this instrumental moment that leads to the guitar solo, very famous, mostly pentatonic, bluesy guitar solo. And then the last part is just a big Aeolian cadence. So A minor, down to the G, and then F natural, G natural, A. So flat 6, flat 7, 1. And we'll talk about that more later in this lecture. But that's the Aeolian cadence, very typical of music of this time. So listen to that carefully. But the point here is that the song itself, and lots of Led Zeppelin songs do this, it works out this balance, or maybe a lack of balance, between the technological obligations of modernity and the deeper primordial connection to nature, right? Now, this will lead us to thinking, along with two very famous philosophers of technology, philosophers who deal with technology. Let's turn to that next, but make sure that you pause it here and listen to Stairway to Heaven and get a sense of what I'm talking about with this vying between technology and natural man. So this problem of technology, this idea that there's a rift between our call toward nature and our uh, indebtedness to technology is something that several writers have talked about and have been concerned with, and sometimes well, often in very different and interesting ways. One example is Martin Heidegger, who in 1954 wrote an essay called The Question Concerning Technology. And he claimed that we treat nature through technology as a standing reserve. What he means by that is we don't see a river, we see a source of power for generators, for water powered generators. We don't see a hillside, we see the potential for coal or oil or whatever's beneath the surface. This then, quote, threatens man with the possibility that it could be denied to him to enter into a more original revealing and hence to experience the call of a more primal truth. So, this focus on technology as an approach to the world so that the world becomes simply something for us to use, a tool for us to use, means that we're no longer treating the world as a thing in itself. This, by the way, is something that people still talk about, obviously, with all the concerns with climate change, that we've treated the world as though it's just there for us to use for our own purposes, that it is a means to our ends instead of it being an end into itself, and that this alienates us from nature. And so, while technology, when treated correctly, gives us a deeper insight into the world, when treated incorrectly, when it's just used as a way to manipulate the world, it alienates us from the world, and that seems to be something that Led Zeppelin is also concerned with, and as we'll see, so is Black Sabbath. Another person who writes a lot about technology is Marshall McLuhan, who in '64 wrote a book called Understanding Media, The Extensions of Man. Notice that subtitle, Extensions of Man. He believed that technological media extended us in various ways. And that the media are important regardless of their content. So he wrote the very famous saying, the medium is the message. And what that means is you can get the same story as a radio play or as a television show, but they're going to be far from the same thing because the medium itself has a huge impact. And more to the point, the medium is doing things to you and telling you things about yourself in the world regardless of what is literally being said. So just the fact that you're listening to radio, for instance, means that you're able to hear farther than your ear would naturally hear. You have all these sounds that are coming into your home that are being broadcast from far away. It's making the world smaller, for instance. And then think about the internet and television first, then the internet, making the world smaller and smaller. Something can happen on the opposite side of the world. And that is something, that kind of news would have taken days, if not weeks, to get across the world at the beginning of this country, for instance, in 1776, let's say. But now, if something happens, I can go on my computer and watch it happen, even if it's all the way on the other side of the world. So this creates a new kind of oral culture in a sense, and television allows us to see farther and differently, and technology, therefore, according to McLuhan, changes us. It does things to us. This is both a good thing and a bad thing, because it's an extension of ourselves. It allows us to do things that we haven't been able to do before. But it can also alienate us from ourselves and from nature and from our human nature. So let's talk about the next band that we're going to consider, and some of these same themes will, of course, apply. And that band is Black Sabbath. Black Sabbath, again, 4 members. Uh, just like Led Zeppelin, they start in the late 60s and go throughout the 70s, so at least in their original version. So from 68 until 79, and in 1979 they fired Ozzy Osbourne and hired Ronnie James Dio. We're not going to be talking about that version of the band. We're only interested in the Ozzy version. And so this is the classic lineup. You've got Geezer Butler. He's the bass player, and he wrote most of the lyrics. Tony Iommi, the guitarist. Bill Ward, the drummer, and then Ozzy Osbourne on vocals. They're a working class group from Birmingham, England, which is a highly industrialized area where the industrial zones and the residential zones are closely interlaced. In other words, and this was true, when they went to school, when they went to grade school, there were factories with heavy machinery right next to their schools, right next to their playgrounds. The drummer, Bill Ward, talked about lying in his bed at night and hearing the factories working and just internalizing all that sound and all that power. And that part of his drumming technique comes from that. And so both of the two early bands of heavy metal, Black Sabbath and Judas Priest, and obviously Black Sabbath being the more important, they both come from that environment. And by the way, so did John Bonham, the drummer from Led Zeppelin. And I don't know if we want to say that accounts for his heavy hand, but he also had a very heavy hand as a drummer. Here's a map where you can see Birmingham sort of in the middle there. And it was in the after the war, they put in a highway that goes from Liverpool in that area through Birmingham to London. So Birmingham becomes connected musically because they're more easily connected through that highway to those sounds. And you know, Black Sabbath in particular was very influenced by the London sounds, the louder sounds. But unlike the London sounds, which were largely blues based, Black Sabbath moves more and more away from a blues influence. Occasionally there's certainly a lot of pentatonic playing in Tony Iommi's solos, for instance, but we're moving further and further away from a blues sound. Their first album, Black Sabbath, was released on Friday, February 13th of 1970. The critics hated the album, but it sold very well, and it features several hallmarks of their style. So it's really indicative of the way that they're going to sound throughout. One of the things, just very quickly, one of the songs that is featured on that first album is the song Black Sabbath. And you can hear right at the very beginning of the song this. Oops. Let's hear a little bit of it. Here it is. The song Black Sabbath. There's some sound effects first, the rain and so on. The bell tolling. But then the riff is going to start, and it's just, it's as you'll hear, it's a G. Well, I thought it was going to start right there. There. Then the octave, and then the tritone. So G, G, C sharp, or D flat with a trill. Now, I didn't mean to switch the slide right there, but if I go back, it'll erase what I was saying before. But that's okay. You can go back and refer to the various characteristics of their sound. You can hear that there's a emphasis, at least to some extent, on the tritone. There's emphasis on the power chord, and the power chord is one of the important aspects of this style in general. The power chord just has the root and the fifth. And so, especially with distortion, it's this very loud, very powerful thing. And the distortion, adds some overtones, and so you might get the sense that it's kind of majorish, but it's really just a root and a fifth, and that's the power chord. Very aggressive drumming style by Bill Ward, as you'll hear. The songs tend to be in multiple parts, so that you have these interludes, instrumental interludes. The solos, and there often are guitar solos, are largely pentatonic. I mean, one of the things that's interesting about Tony Iommi is that he's very consistent in using the pentatonic scale in a lot of his playing. There's some chromaticism, but for the most part, we're talking about pentatonic when he's playing solos. We'll see the riffs in a moment. The music is largely riff-based, so you have these very memorable, I think, riffs that stand out in the songs. there's as far as the lyrics are concerned, which is what this particular slide is meant to go over. Uh, the lyrics are by Geezer Butler, and they emphasize these themes of the macabre, of doom, of nuclear war. That's a lot of it, is sort of Cold War sex, hypocrisy, gothic imagery, witchcraft, political corruption, mental disease. There's almost a total avoidance of themes of romantic love or sex. And so while they play with topics that are based in horror and despair, the lyrics usually promote a positive message. There's usually at the end of it some kind of moral or message that you're supposed to take away from it that is largely positive, usually about freedom or about thinking for yourself or about trying to avoid um, bad things happening to you and so on. And so they're dealing with where there are songs like Paranoid, which deals with mental health with paranoia. He winds up saying at the end, don't be like me, more or less. And while they all were involved at various times with drugs, they have songs that warn you against drugs. So Snowblind, which is their song about cocaine, is really meant to be a kind of cautionary tale. The poetry can be somewhat amateurish. Sometimes he rhymes words with repetitions of that word, and the lines don't always fit within the poetic rhythm established. The themes are often adolescence, so you have comic book imagery and a lack of nuance. And yet they provide a real alternative to the typical themes of hard rock, and they were incredibly influential. Let's listen to a couple of songs real quick, just to get a sense of some of the things we're talking about. Here's a bit of Paranoid, and you'll hear the opening is these power chords with that little riff. So notice that main riff, right? That main riff is mostly around E. So you have E over and over and over again. Then it comes down to D, and then G, D, E. Um, Pretty simple riff, right? Notice, by the way, that you have the tonic is E, and the dominant that they're using is not B, but rather D. So it's very typical, as you'll see in my video that talks about another song by them, Children of the Grave, one of my analysis videos on YouTube. Uh, a lot of their songs use the flat 7 as the dominant, not the 5 chord as the dominant. And that becomes very typical in the 1970s, especially with heavy metal. And you can see how this might work. I mean, the 5 chord traditionally in the key of E would be B, and so it would be B, D sharp, F sharp. A chord built on 7 would have D natural, F sharp, A. So you have some of the same notes. You still have the leading tone, of course, but it's lowered now. It's a flat 7 instead of the natural 7. But there's still the sense that 7 goes to 1, and that the scale degree 2, the in this case F sharp, would come down to 1, and that happens, for instance, in the vocals in this song, because when he's singing that G over and over again, and then that comes down. D reaches up to the F sharp, down to the E. So finished with my woman, right down the E, cause she couldn't, down the D, couldn't help me with my mind, F sharp, E, E, right? So a lot of those, uh, a lot of those things that you expect tonally are happening, they're just altered. So you still have 2-to-1 at a cadence, and you still have 7-to-1 at the cadence, but now it's the lowered 7. It's the D coming up to the E. Another great example, of course, for them is Iron Man, which is the comic book kind of character that they've created, who is saving people comes back from the future. Actually, not to save people. He comes back. He tried to save people. Tried to save them, but they didn't appreciate him. So he comes back from the future and winds up attacking. War Pigs, of course, is the classic. And then you'll see my video with Children of the Grave. They have a string of we're going to come back to War Pigs in just a second. They have a string of successful albums. The album Paranoid from 71, Master of Reality also 71, Volume 4 72, Sabbath Bloody Sabbath 73. These are all classics. They're amazing. The following albums were less impressive, but they still contain some great songs. And then Ozzy leaves because of his addiction issues. Their songs really anticipate almost all the subgenres that will follow immediately from this in the 70s and 80s, including speed metal, thrash, power metal, death metal, and we'll talk about power metal a little bit today and the others later in the semester. So here are the lyrics to War Pigs. It gives you some sense of both the lyrical approach and the song. Let's hear just a tiny bit of it, but you see the opening: generals gathered in their masses, just like witches at black masses, evil minds that plot destruction, sorcerer of death's construction. That's all we're going to listen to. It's all this kind of Cold War mass destruction mixed with a kind of vengeance of God kind of thing. I want you to notice a few things. First of all is the main riff. After the opening prelude, the main riff is just D to E, so that flat 7 to tonic 1. And when he's singing going up the E major chord, where he's emphasizing E, G sharp, A, B, and then up to a high E. But when he comes back down, it's going to be E, D, E, B, A, G natural down to E. So he goes up with the major chord, down with the minor chord. See if you notice it, but it's a kind of a cool effect. Here's a bit of War Pigs. There's the feedback. Just it's meant to be very forceful, very heavy, hence heavy metal. Just back and forth between E and D, and now we're just gonna get D E as the riff that he's gonna sing over here. Up the E major chord, just like witches at black masses, and then minor down. Evil minds that plot destruction, which gives it that sense of forcing its way up, and then falling back down. And then a new riff. Oh, wait, not yet. Little lick here. As the war machine keeps turning. And hatred to mankind, poisoning their brainwashed minds. Oh, Lord, then a new lick. Chromatic, right? So just D, E, and then G, F sharp, F natural, E. Now this song is one of my favorites by them. It's so interesting, all the riffs. I was going to do the analysis about this, but the other one seemed like I get through it shorter, and it was a 15-minute video. So if I were to try to do this one, I think it would just go on too long. But there are so many cool things about this song, you really should try to listen to the whole thing. Here are the lyrics for Children of the Grave. We won't spend any time on this because I've because that's what my video is all about. But maybe when you're watching my video, you can read through the lyrics real quick. Now, what happens with uh, Black Sabbath is they really inspire a whole bunch of other bands. So several bands start to emerge in the latter half of the 70s that are following the anti-blues approach of Black Sabbath and Judas Priest, and they begin to get more critical and popular attention. And there are several of these bands. There's Saxon and Venom, which most of us probably haven't heard of, but then there's also Motorhead and Iron Maiden, which most of us probably have heard of. The scene was dubbed the new wave of British heavy metal by journalist Jeff Barton in the British music newspaper Sounds in May of '79, and it was heavily promoted by a fairly famous DJ of the time named DJ Neil Kay. The style took heavy metal and infused it with elements of punk, producing aggressive songs. There's a rise of the sound, or rather, the rise of the sound coincided with a proliferation of small labels. So here we have the rise of independent labels that I promised you, and we'll see that also with punk. So it starts off really as an underground phenomenon. The lyrics usually are using images from mythology and fantasy and horror, just like we saw with Black Sabbath. Oh, and I didn't emphasize it, but notice that War Pigs, Children of the Grave, all of those songs are very skeptical about technology because they're all very concerned with mutually assured destruction, MAD, and the Cold War. And so there's this fear of technology, having alienated us from our human nature. So these lyrics are following some of those same ideas. The music has something of a do-it-yourself sensibility with the raw volume of punk, but then there are also in some bands, especially like Iron Maiden, there are some elements of real virtuosity, and we'll see that in a second with Iron Maiden. The music appeals to a young, white, male working class audience, many of whom suffered from the 73-75 recession that took place here and in Britain. It's largely considered a hyper-masculine and depoliticized style. So it emphasizes, at least among the audiences, the consumption of beer, an indulgence in nihilism that nothing really matters. And the people who listen to this they are known as headbangers, in part because they make that characteristic move while listening to the bands, or they're banging their head back and forth and their long hair's flopping back and forth. One of these bands, of course, is Motorhead, and the example for them is Ace of Spades. Let's hear just the tiniest bit of that. This is a good example of heavy metal being combined with punk. Notice their little mascot there, right? This, who knows what the heck that thing is, but it looks aggressive, to say the least. So the lyrics or the singing rather is very clearly shouting, screaming. It's coming out of a punk tradition, but combining that with the heavy metal elements of guitar. The next band, of course, also has a mascot, and this is one of the most famous mascots in heavy metal. This is the mascot's named Eddie, or sometimes Eddie the Head, and it's designed by Derek Riggs. And all of their albums have some version of him doing various things. Here he's a killer, as you can see, holding an axe. Here he's, I guess, pulling the strings of Satan there. So he's the power behind Satan. And this is the album Number of the Beast from 1982. And I would love for you to listen to the song Number of the Beast. But the one we're going to listen to now, very quickly, is from the album Power Slave from 1984. Because it's a great example of the kinds of things they do. Their song structures, like Black Sabbath, have many parts. They often have an epic nature, and that's the case with this song. They exploit systems based often on the Aeolian cadence, so that flat 6, flat 7, 1 thing that we were talking about. But what they do is they make things more complicated. So they'll have that progression that they'll move to different scale degrees, right? So for instance, in this song, it starts with F sharp, doing that progression, the Aeolian progression, and then moves up to A, doing that same progression. And then later, it's focused on E, doing that same progression, and then A, doing that same progression. So you can see it highlights different different tonal areas, but constantly referring to that progression. They're also a progenitor, really, of the power metal style. So that has to do really with the singing as well as the virtuosity. So you have these very virtuosic guitar parts, especially as you'll hear with Aces High, which we'll hear in just a second. The guitar parts are related to each other so that they're harmonized. So you have two guitars that are basically playing soloistic material at the same time, and they're harmonized, in this case, in thirds. But also the virtuosity of the singing. Bruce Dickinson is one of the great operatic metal singers, and that's really what gives power metal its sound. And I don't know if we'll have time to listen to other power metal bands later, but like one of my favorites is Halloween, and maybe we'll get a chance to listen to a little bit of that. Here's Aces High. Now, Aces High is a good example because a lot of their songs are very skeptical about violence, and they're sort of these lessons against violence, and yet at the same time they have this kind of British pride in the successes of World War II, and that's what this song is really about. You'll hear a little bit of Churchill in the beginning, and then you'll hear the main riff. Oh, I guess the Churchill's only on the video version. But notice the harmonized guitars. And we move into a new riff. Hear the Aeolian cadence there? Dum, 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 dum. Notice that just like a lot of Black Sabbath songs, he's singing along with the riff. And then the whole thing moves up. So a lot of virtuosity, a lot of really intricate guitar parts that relate to each other in interesting ways, and then that voice that really carries through. And I suppose we should hear the part that really makes it famous, the soaring chorus. Notice the harmonies with the voice. So Bruce Dickinson, right? This pretty impressive singer. But at the same time, singing along the lines of Black Sabbath, where at least at first he's just following the riff, just like Ozzy often does with Black Sabbath songs. And then, of course, he breaks away from it and sings in a much more operatic fashion than Ozzy really is capable of doing. So that's it for today. That's session 15, and I'll see you back for session 16.